Hey guys, welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about my favorite Jeskai commander, Narset, Enlightened Master. For 3, a blue, a red, and a white, we get a 3/2 legendary human monk with first strike, hexproof, and a triggered ability that exiles the top 4 cards of our library, allowing us to cast any non-creature cards exiled by Narset until the end of turn without paying their mana cost. Narset is probably the closest I get to cEDH, so I'm going to do this deck tech a little differently than my previous deck techs. Let's talk about the win con first, and then explore how we get there. Before that, I want to analyze the wording on Narset. Notice her triggered ability is an attack trigger. This means once we declare her as an attacker, we get the trigger. It's not like my previous Brago King Eternal deck tech, where he had to deal combat damage. If an opponent doesn't want us to get the trigger, they need to kill her before we move to combat. Additionally, her trigger is independent of her once it happens, so if an opponent blocks and kills Narset, we still get the opportunity to cast those non-creature cards later that turn. Now, she has hexproof, so not many removal spells are going to work, but be aware, players can remove hexproof and use stifle effects to stop her trigger. Players will also use edict effects, forcing you to sacrifice her. She's a 6-drop, not something we want to be casting over and over again. Secondly, just because we can cast spells without paying mana cost does not mean timing restrictions are removed. If we exile a mana rock or a sorcery, we need to wait until proper timing to cast them. We do, however, have until the end of turn, so let's say we exile a counter spell, a removal spell, an extra combat spell, and a mana rock. We can cast a mana rock and the extra combat spell in our next main phase, and then hold up the removal and the counter magic as a sort of second hand while we proceed through our second combat and exile 4 new cards. The last thing I want to know is even though Narset exiles the spells, once we cast them, they resolve and they go to the graveyard. The only cards that will remain in exile are the lands and any spells we don't cast, like, say, a counterspell that we couldn't cast. So, with that, the win cons. So the objective of this deck is to cast Enter the Infinite and Omniscience. Enter the Infinite is a 12-drop sorcery for 8 generic and 4 blue. This sorcery allows us to draw cards equal to the number of cards in our library, then put 1 card from our hand on top of our library, and grants us no maximum hand size until the end of our next turn. Ideally, Narset wants to exile this card, so we may cast it for free. Once we have our entire library in our hand, we're going to have all of our interaction and disruption. However, we can't cast spells from our hand for free. Luckily, Enter the Infinite has us place 1 card back on top of our library. We're going to place Omniscience on top. We then cast an extra combat spell to get Narset's trigger and exile Omniscience off Narset. When combat ends and our next main phase begins, we can cast it for free. Now we can play our whole deck for free. Don't forget, we only have an infinite hand size until the end of our next turn's end step. So let's go over our extra turn and extra combat spells. We run a total of 10 extra turn spells and 8 extra combat spells. Statistically, we have a 1 in 6 chance of drawing into one of these cards per draw, or in this case, per exile trigger. Keep in mind, we will be thinning our deck via tutors and fetch lands to up the odds in our favor. Temporal Mastery has an opportunity to be cast for a miracle cost of 1 and a blue. Karn's Temporal Sundering permits us to bounce a target non-land permanent. Walk the Aeons has a really steep buyback of sacrificing 3 islands. We only do this in dire need, but it's nice to have because we don't usually pay for our spells. Beacon of Tomorrows and Nexus of Fate both shuffle into their owners' libraries upon resolution. With these 2 cards being cast after Enter the Infinite, we'll always have an extra turn card for Narset to exile and cast for free, essentially granting us infinite turns. Expropriate has all players vote time or money. Then, for each money vote, we get to choose a permanent controlled by that player and gain control of it. Remember, this effect doesn't end at the end of turn. For each time vote, we get to take an extra turn. We first vote and don't need to gain control of one of our own permanents, so it's safe to say we're gonna get at least 1 extra turn. Expropriate and Temporal Mastery are the only 2 spells that exile upon resolution. Lastly, we have Time Stretch, which grants us 2 extra turns. As for extra combat spells, the most valuable spell would be Fury of the Horde. The reason is because this has an alternative casting cost. We can exile 2 red cards from our hand instead of paying the 7 CMC. This spell will fast track our win con. After Enter the Infinite draws our whole deck, we place Omniscience back and we can cast Fury of the Horde for its alternative casting cost, exiling 2 red cards to get the extra combat right away and ensure we get Omniscience out the same turn. During our next draw phase, we don't want to draw Omniscience because we probably won't have the mana to cast it. Waves of Aggression has Retrace, so we get an added value of being permitted to cast it from our graveyard by paying its normal casting cost, in addition to discarding a land. Seize the Day has Flashback for 2 and a red. Savage Beating is the only instant extra combat spell and must be cast during combat. We only have from the moment we announce Narset as an attacker through the damage dealing phase to cast a spell. Savage Beating also has the ability to give Narset double strike until end of turn if we cast it with the Entwine cost. Something to note is that Entwine is an additional cost, not an alternative cost. So even if we cast it without paying the spell's CMC via our commander, we can still choose to tap mana to pay the additional 1 and a red to entwine the spell. Alright guys, let's move on to the ramp section. First, we have our usual suspects, as this deck is mana rock intensive. We run as many 0 to 2 drop mana rocks as possible and look for those that produce colored mana and multiple colorless mana. But I want to focus on one in particular, Lion's Eye Diamond. This 0 drop mana rock is activated by discarding our hand and sacrificing itself to add 3 mana of any one color to our mana pool. We use this card because we want Narset out fast. Since she's cast from the command zone, pitching our hand isn't a downfall. Keep in mind, once she's out, she's also going to get 4 free spells per turn. This is good to ramp her out super fast, super early, or absorb the commander tax later in the game, but it's advised not to rush. Players in cEDH always have counter magic. Be aware of your playgroup style. We run 13 rocks, and 6 of them have a CMC of 0. We can possibly get her out on turn 1. However, if we activate LED and she's countered, we won't have a hand and we'll probably be playing the draw-go game for the next several turns. Speaking from experience, a turn 1 Narset feels amazing. Not doing anything for several turns because my opponent had Force of Will waiting really sucks. Our other ramp spells are Rite of Flame and Simian Spirit Guide. We run Simian Spirit Guide because we can pitch it for a red mana and get Narset out unexpectedly 1 turn earlier. Additionally, we need a red card to exile to Fury of the Horde after we draw our whole deck. Rite of Flame is good because even though Narset permits us to cast spells she exiles for free, the ones in our hands cost mana. Rite of Flame also brings up our Storm count, but we'll touch on Storm in a little bit. This deck only runs 29 lands, and sometimes we're behind on land drops. Keep in mind, lands exiled off Narset stay in exile. Weathered Wayfarer and Expedition Map let us tutor any land to make sure we fix our colors. Additionally, Tithe allows us to tutor a Plains. Not a basic Plains, but a Plains. The most optimal time to cast this is right after cracking a fetch land and we momentarily have less lands than an opponent, or if we're already behind on land drops. If we have less lands than target opponent, we're allowed to tutor 2 Plains instead of 1. This is a great way to get shock lands to our hand to color fix, and also make sure that we're making land drops for the next couple turns. Narset is most effective when we know what's on top of our library, so let's move on to the section I call Top Deck. Personal Tutor, Mystical Tutor, and Enlightened Tutor let us search our deck for Enter the Infinite, Omniscience, and Counter Magic, placing them on top of our deck, just where Narset wants them when she triggers. Long-Term Plans places the card we tutored for 3rd from the top, still within her range. Merchant Scroll lets us tutor for a blue instant and put it into our hand. Great for holding up counter magic or grabbing Enter the Infinite and activating Scroll Rack, or casting Brainstorm, making sure it's right on top of our deck when we go to combat. We also run Sensei's Divining Top. Being able to look at and rearrange the top 3 cards is valuable information when trying to map out turns, draws, and what we want to get exiled off our commander's triggers. It can also set us up to make our land drops. The best way to use this is at the end of our last opponent's turn, so that if there's any lands in the top 3, we make sure to draw them during our draw phase. Another way this deck creates value is by copying spells and triggers and storming off. Let's move on to copy effects. First, we run Strionic Resonator. We can activate it for 2 generic and copy Narset's trigger. This will allow us to exile 4 additional cards we can potentially cast for free later this turn. Thousand Year Storm is how this deck really gets out of control. Whenever we cast an instant or a sorcery spell, we get to copy it for each other instant and sorcery spell we've cast before it this turn. Breakdown. Let's say Thousand Year Storm is on the battlefield and we cast Mystical Tutor during our pre-combat main phase. That's our first instant or sorcery we have cast, so nothing additional happens yet. When we move on to combat with Narset, her combat trigger triggers and exiles Path to Exile, Time Warp, Relentless Assault, and a land. Relieve the land in exile, and then cast Path to Exile. Even though this is in a different phase, it is still our second instant or sorcery spell we've cast this turn. Thousand Year Storm creates 1 copy of Path to Exile. The copy is even created if our Path to Exile was countered. We resolve our copy of Path to Exile first, and then we resolve our original hardcast Path to Exile. Now we move on to our second main phase, and we cast Time Warp. Thousand Year Storm then creates 2 copies of Time Warp on the stack because we have previously cast 2 other instant and sorcery spells this turn. Copy number 2 will resolve. Then copy number 1 will resolve. Now our original cast of Time Warp resolves. We now have 3 extra turns to take after this turn is completed. Let's say we aren't finished yet and cast Relentless Assault. Thousand Year Storm then creates 3 copies of Relentless Assault, because we have previously cast 3 other instant and sorcery spells this turn. All 3 copies resolve one by one, then our original cast resolves. We have now just stacked 4 more additional combats this turn. We now untap Narset and move to our second combat. Narset triggers and exiles 4 more cards. The next spell we cast, Thousand Year Storm, will generate 4 copies of the spell, plus the original spell we cast, and so on for the rest of the turn. We want to cast as many spells as possible within our turn, because when we pass the turn to, ourselves, Thousand Year Storm will restart at 0 copies. I've stacked over 100 additional combats and 300 extra turns before passing the turn to myself to do it again in the past. Please note, be a good sport. When players eventually scoop, don't continue to play it out to see how many turns or combats you were going to make. Play test it in your own time. Thousand Year Storm isn't our only copy effect, as we run Fork and Narset's Reversal as well. To conclude our copy effects, we're going to run Mind's Desire. This spell has us shuffle our library, then exile the top card of our library. Until the end of the turn, we may cast that spell without paying its mana cost. Storm. Storm is a keyword that means we get to copy Mind's Desire an additional time for each spell we've cast before it this turn. It's really similar to Thousand Year Storm, except it counts anything. All cards except for lands are spells on the stack, so each 0-drop mana rock we've previously cast this turn will add to how many copies we create. Remember, the copies of Mind's Desire generated by Storm Count can't be copied by Thousand Year Storm because they aren't cast. However, the cards exiled off the copies of Mind's Desire are cast and can be copied. Most players aren't going to let us cast an extra turn or an extra combat spell. They're going to have counter magic, and so will we. Let's move on to Disruption. When Narset triggers and exiles the top 4 cards of our library, the best way we get our extra combat and extra turn spells to resolve is to include a large number of counter magic, so hopefully we get a free counter spell in the pile. We're going to be running 9 counter spells, and 3 of them have the option to be cast without paying their mana cost, without needing to be exiled off Narset. In addition to those 9 spells, we're including Trick Bind and Disallow, just in case someone wants to activate an ability of something in play and disrupt us. We're also running 4 removal spells just in case someone has strong blockers. In addition to a strong interactive suite of counters, we also run silence to prevent opponents from casting interaction once it resolves. If a player has interaction, this is when they have to cast it. If we exile silence off Narset, we can cast it first thing while in combat to prevent players from ruining our game of solitaire. We also run Orm's Chant as a duplicate effect. However, this only prevents one player from casting spells versus all of our opponents. It's still good because it shuts down 33% of possible threats, and if we draw it naturally, it's good to stop a Kiki-Jiki combo, or just to prevent another player who might have a win con they just tutored for from going off that turn. Angel's Grace is another card we hold up to stop an opponent from winning. We're also including Revoke Existence because a lot of combos require an artifact or an enchantment to go off. We don't want anyone getting to that point before us. We also need to remove stack effects like Trinosphere. Our deck won't be very effective if each spell we get to cast for free still costs us 3 generic to cast. Our last disruption spell is Temporal Cascade. This modal sorcery has the option to have all players shuffle their hands and graveyards into their libraries, or allow each player to draw 7 cards. It can be entwined for an additional 2 generic mana. We run this 7-drop for 5 blue for 2 reasons. 1, some of what we need might have been countered and in the graveyard, so this provides a second opportunity. But primarily, we don't want our opponents to have hands. You can't play solitaire if people keep interacting. Personally, I'll never entwine this because I'm getting 4 free spells a turn off Narset. I don't need a hand. Our opponents don't have the luxury of getting 4 free spells per turn, so without a hand, they lose win cons, disruption, and everything in between. Opponents with no hands don't usually counter our extra turn spells, and when we pass the turn to ourselves, they still don't have any cards. Except maybe if they have a Rhystic Study, but since our spells are free, we usually pay the 1 so they can't draw. Our last non-land card isn't really disruption, but I had nowhere else to put it, so it's gonna go right here. Our last non-land card is Need for Speed, a 1-drop enchantment for a red that's activated by sacrificing a land and providing target creature haste. Nothing better than swinging in with Narset the turn we get her out. Well, it's pretty much the deck. Let's move on to the land base. Now again, lands are going to be optimized to what you can afford, so this section is dependent specifically on the deck builder's wallet, unfortunately. Nothing worse than whiffing on a Narset trigger and exiling 3 lands, so we're only running 29. We start off with 3 basic islands, 3 basic mountains, and 2 basic plains. This deck, more than any, needs lands to enter the battlefield untapped and provide any of our 3 colors. So, we have 6 sources that enter the battlefield untapped and can provide any of our 3 colors. We also run Exotic Orchard because this land will basically give us every color we need. One of those 6 sources is Cavern of Souls, and probably the most important land in this deck. Narset costs 6 mana to cast. Having to pay commander tax every time somebody counters her can lock us out of the game. Cavern makes her uncounterable. It's our prime target to tutor for with Expedition Map and Weathered Wayfarer. Our second target with either of those tutors is Hall of the Bandit Lord, so that we can give Narset haste. Moving on, Teleria West can be transmuted for 1 blue to seek out our Lion's Eye Diamond, any of our 0-drop mana rocks, and our Pact of Negation. Ancient Tomb is the only land in this deck that provides strictly colorless mana, but it's ramp. We run all 3 pain lands in Battlefield Forge, Shivan Reef, and Idakar Waste. We run the 3 Shocklands in addition to a Prairie Stream because they're all plains, and we can tutor them with our Tithe. To conclude, we run 66% of our poor man's fetch package, being Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse. In addition, we run 2 big boy fetch lands, being Polluted Delta and Flooded Strand. Of course, if you have any OG dual lands or better fetches like Arid Mesa, by all means include them to optimize your build. These are just the lands that I have. Well guys, that's it for my Narset cEDH deck tech. It's a bit more competitive than my other builds, so I hope you enjoyed the video. Now I ask you, do you play cEDH? Who's your favorite cEDH commander? Would you pilot this build in your meta? Well guys, thanks for watching, and always remember to leave mana open for interaction.